Great. Hello, my name is Mary Alice. I'm the Public Affairs Manager here at Maine Association of Nonprofits, and you are here to join us for Demystifying Wage and Hour Laws for Arts and Culture Organizations. Um, I'm actually gonna hand it over to Nat, who is our supporter, our sponsor for the day. And this whole thing was Nat's idea, and so I'm gonna let Nat talk about the need and why we're all here today.
Thanks, Mary Alice. You're giving me undue credit. Actually, this idea of hosting this session comes because Maine Association of Nonprofits and Mary Alice hosted a similar webinar last summer when we were looking at some labor law policy changes at the federal government. And at the Onion Foundation, we want to help our grantees understand how things work in the world. We want our grantees to be healthy organizations, and we actually, ask people about their experience managing their organizations and being employers. And we want the employees of our organizations to be healthy and happy with their jobs. And we want the organizations to figure out how to take care of their workers. And last summer, when we started to learn about some of these changes, I started asking folks about what they thought and what they knew. And it became clear that this is a very confusing area. Labor law is very confusing. In my past work as an executive director, I've had many questions and tried to figure it out. And so this is just a chance for us to respond to this need that we saw. And we hope that it's helpful for you. So thank you so much, Mary Alice and John and Anne, for making all this happen so that we can get some of our questions answered and learn some things.
That. Fabulous. So with that, I'm going to introduce Anne. So Anne, if you have come to a program before, you may have seen her. She is coming back to us, which we're very grateful for. So Anne is a shareholder at Bernstein Shur and provides a wide range of labor and employment services to public and private sector clients, including the City of Portland and Bath Iron Works and USM, and advises on the myriad state and employment laws, including but not limited to the alphabet soup of ADA, FMLA, FLSA, and MHRA. And I think I know what all of those are, so I feel very proud of myself. And also serves as a neutral investigator in sensitive employment matters, including discrimination, harassment, retaliation, and handling matters with empathy and thoughtfulness for all parties involved, which is why we asked her here today. We appreciate that. And has also served as an employer side representative on the Maine Labor Relations Board since 2022. So Anne knows her stuff, which we are very grateful for. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that Anne can start sharing her slides. And I'm going to take myself off of camera, but I will be monitoring the chat, and I will come on kind of when it's time for the Q&As. We're going to try and save most questions for the end. If there's like a few clarifying things maybe that come up, I might interrupt, but for the most part, we have some scenarios at the end that Nat developed and that Nat worked with Anne on, and I think that those will help clarify questions. So just know that those are coming, and that we're going to get through some heady stuff at the beginning. So thank you, Anne. I'll let you take it over.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sorry. We will be sending a recording and the slides, and we'll be doing a blog post. I just saw that question just to address it. Yes, we'll have the recording and the slides and the follow-up. So you don't need to be copy pasting or screenshotting everything.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Mary Alice, and thank you, Nat, for having me. I think the presentation that Nat was speaking about was one I may have done when we thought the salary threshold for exempt employees was going up pretty significantly. We're going to talk about whether that's still the case or not. Hopefully, you know it's not. That some things changed, some courts got involved, and here we are, and we'll talk about that in this slideshow. I do represent a number of nonprofits. I have nonprofits from small, as few as 5, 10 employees to quite a bit more than that as well. And so, I also understand the unique challenges that face nonprofits. Usually it's budgets and money, and you know, a lot of that is what drives decisions that you make. You know, and I hope you find this presentation helpful, in the sense that you know, now you'll know maybe how you might want to do things a little differently, how you may want to structure things a little differently. I sometimes say that I'm kind of Debbie Downer. I don't intend to be that way. But hopefully you get something out of this. If you know, there will be time for questions at the end. There's a lot of material in this presentation. So save them till the end, save your questions until the end, and hopefully we'll have a little time to talk through some of the scenarios as well, which I think may help answer some of your questions. So just to start, we're, you know, really what we're focusing on today is wage and hour law, right? We sort of generally call it that in my field. It's wage and hour law. And there are two primary sort of bodies of law, if you will. One is the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA is what we refer to it, you know, the employment law alphabet soup that I'm sure many of you are used to: FLSA, FMLA, ADA, PFML, all of those, right? So this is the FLSA. And then Maine also has its own wage and hour statutes. Some of the regulations overlap, some of the laws overlap. So FLSA and Maine law have a minimum wage and they require overtime. But Maine also has, you know, other rules. And so it's not always commonsensical. It's not always intuitive, but, you know, I think maybe it's the Lawyers Protection Act. I don't know, but, you know, hopefully I will help to demystify some of that today. Just briefly, you know, as it relates to what we're talking about today, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the primary areas that I deal with, and I would say most attorneys, when, you know, they talk about Fair Labor Standards Act, what they're dealing with is minimum wage, right? There is a federal minimum wage. I think we'll talk about what it is. There's an overtime requirement under the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act. There's a record keeping requirement, right? That certain employees must keep track of their time and all of their hours worked. And then also there are child labor implications under the FLSA. Maine law also has minimum wage requirements, has overtime requirements. The list of things we deal with under Maine law are a little, include timing of wage payments. How frequently are you required to pay your employees? What happens when an employee leaves, whether they leave voluntarily or whether they're terminated? Rest breaks, you know, that's governed by state law, whether and when an employee is entitled to a rest break, and limits on mandatory overtime. But you'll notice over these last two slides, I highlighted minimum wage and overtime because those are really going to be the focus of today. And you're like, okay, well, which one do we follow, right? How does that work if they both have, if they both regulate minimum wage and overtime? And the answer is the one that provides greater benefits to the employees. And so we're going to talk about the various benefits that each of them provide. And so which one you'll have to, which one you follow depending on the circumstances. And you know, that should, before I go on to the next slide, that should be fairly, what I think of it as. If you're following the one that provides more benefits to the employees, by default, you're following the other one as well. So that's sort of that's really the rationale there is, if Maine provides more benefits, you're complying with Maine law. And by default, you're therefore complying. Oh, more than complying, but you're complying with the federal law. So that's the general rule of thumb. So under the definition of employee is quite frankly circular, and sometimes there have been volumes, reams of case law that talk about the definition of an employee, depending on what statute you're reading. Is it a state statute? Is it federal law? These are some of the most frequently used definitions. Well, an employee is an individual employed by an employer, Well, that's really not helpful. An employer includes any person acting directly or indirectly in the interest of the employer. I mean, a little more helpful, maybe. Um, an employee is someone who an employer employs and includes to suffer or permit to work. You allow someone to suffer or permit to work. Again, volumes of cases, reams of cases have been written in trying to assess what this means. And really um, there are all sorts of exceptions to that, and that's one of the areas that we're going to talk about today. I want to just mention that I highlight some of these things not to make you experts, right? That's not the goal of today's session, is not to um, make you experts, but to allow you to issue spot, right? And that's a term we often use in the legal world, but it's to say, ooh, am I, is this an area within my organization that I might want to take a look at, right? So to the extent you're taking furious notes, you don't need to, but what I want to highlight is it's messy. It's not clear, and there's a lot of what we're going to talk about today that's gray. There's a lot of gray area in this realm of the law, in any sort of area of law, but particularly in this area. So, of course, there are tons of exceptions, all sorts of exceptions. And, that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the overtime exemptions, right? And that is people who are exempt from the law. And you're like, okay, well, what does that have to do with me? And it has to do with you, because it's all about how you classify your employees. Or I'm going to say, I shouldn't say employees, it's how you classify the people that do work for you, right? And I think that's probably a better way to talk about it. Because some of the overtime exemptions are not necessarily for employees per se, and we're going to talk about that. Actually, we're going to talk about that at the very beginning. Right. One of the ways that, workers for you would be exempt from overtime is if they're independent contractors. Right. And so, that usually means you're issuing them a 1099. Sometimes you might be paying them hourly. Sometimes you might be paying them a flat fee for the work that they do. But usually they're independent contractors, so they're not employees. So the same rules on minimum wage and overtime don't apply. Now, in 2015, the DOL that I'm talking about here is the federal DOL. They issued a memo that most workers essentially are employees. The federal law follows what is called the economic realities test. Where they sort of ask three questions. Is the worker economically dependent upon the employer? Is the worker in business for him or herself or themselves? Are they, do they do this work for other people? And is the worker's profit or loss affected by their business decisions? So the more that the more efficient they're able to do the work for you, etc. Is, are they, is their profit and loss, is their bottom line affected by how they do the work for you? Now, I'm just giving you a quick intro there. And like I said, I'm going to be flying through these slides so we can really talk about the scenarios, which is, I think, where you'll get the most benefit out of. But under Maine law similarly, has a similar kind of test. But I will tell you that when the law changed in Maine, and I don't exactly know when, it is really hard for for someone to be an independent contractor under Maine law. Now, I took this straight from the as you see, the Department of Labor website, right, for how you some factors, if you will, that you can utilize to determine whether or not someone is an independent contractor. And again, this is under the FLSA, the federal law, right? So the indicators of an employee are, they're working for someone else's business. They generally can only earn more by working additional hours. So this is the indicator of an employee. They typically use the employer's tools and equipment, materials. They only work for that employer. They continuing or indefinite relationships. So they have an ongoing relationship, right? Not that one that's limited, but we'll talk about that as well. The employer really kind of decides how and when the work will be performed. And the employer assigns the work to be performed, right? Those are just some factors to consider. This isn't one of those, every single one of these needs to check the box kind of. This is more like, okay, let's do a little bit of a litmus test, like which side does this person seem to fit more squarely in? Indicators of independent contractor, right? They're in business for themselves. They can increase their profit through business decisions, right? Do I need to hire 3 people to do this job, or can I do this job myself? They typically have their own materials, their own tools. They often work for multiple different clients, often who are in the same type of business, maybe not. I mean, classic examples of independent contractors are electricians. They work for a variety of different entities, helping entities who aren't in the business of doing electrical work, and so they come in and they help folks with the electrical work. The relationship is often temporary with independent contractors. The independent contractor typically has a lot of sway in how they do the work, maybe not as to the final finished product, but certainly how they get to that finished product. And they often decide what work or projects they will take on. They have some flexibility to say, I don't want to put in a bid for that, or maybe I do. Similarly, so Maine's independent contractor law is pretty rigid. It's pretty difficult under Maine law to have a worker be an independent contractor. And this is one of those. So sometimes in the law, we talk about multi-factor tests, and sometimes it's like over here, which side does it feel better? It's sort of a, you don't have to check every box, but let's figure it out. Under Maine law, at least the first part of Maine's law, the all 5 of these factors must be met if you're going to be an independent contractor. And it's interesting because, I was talking about the various definitions of an employees versus independent contractors and how they differ from one statute to another. Maine's definition of independent contractor cites to, I believe it's the unemployment statute, right? So this definition lives in the unemployment statute, but it's referenced in the wage and hour laws. So it says the definition of employee is consistent with, and then it cites to the statute, which links you to, I believe, the unemployment statute. So that's where this is one of the few statutes that says, oh, we're just going to adopt the definition from this other law, which is always very helpful to us because, more often than not, every single statute has its own definition of what an employee is, what an employer is, and it can get rather confusing. So this is a little helpful to that extent. So to be an independent contract in Maine, all 5 A through E have to be met. So the individual has to have the essential right to control the means and progress of the work, except to the final results. The individual is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business. Like I said, classic example is electrician. Painters often fit in that category. Any of, your plumbers, that sort of thing. Individual has an opportunity for profit and loss as a result of the services being performed for the other individual or entity. the individual hires and pays their own assistants if they have any, to the extent that the assistants are employees. The independent contractor is supervising those people. And then the individual makes individual services available to some clients or customers in the community, even if the individual's right to do so is voluntarily. And not, so if they decide they only want to work for you, then that's their decision, but they have to have the ability to work with other clients or customers in the community. And then, so once you've checked all these boxes, right, A through E, then the next step in determining whether somebody's an independent contractor is at least 3 of the following must be met under Maine's law. So this is one of those that, as long as you check 3 here, then the person is an independent contractor. And so you all will get these slides. The point that I want to make in having you, review these and understand this is how difficult it is for workers to actually be independent contractors under Maine law. Another overtime exemption that some of you may utilize are interns. But as with a lot of things, there are special regulations under the DOL, which govern whether they're true interns or not, right? Sometimes you have unpaid internships, which are fine. And often, this with nonprofits, it's a little bit trickier, because you also have the opportunity to have volunteers. So when does a volunteer become an intern? And what I say is, you can't just hire an intern to make copies, and make copies and coffee, right? They actually have to have their, it's not a prolonged job interview. The employer may benefit. It really is about educating the intern and having them learn about your business, learn about your organization, learn about the processes and that sort of thing. So that is and again, they can be unpaid, but that would be sort of an overtime exempt type of an employee. Volunteers, nonprofits, and so nonprofits and public entities are the only types of entities under the law who are permitted to have volunteers. You can't volunteer for private, for-profit entities. You can't make any promise or expectation of payment to the person, no pressure or coercion from the employer. And they're not the same job duties as a regular job that you already have in the organization. You may provide a stipend. So you can pay, and I'm going to talk about that. There are 3 types of payments you can provide to your volunteers. One is for expenses, right? So if they have to travel, if they have to buy supplies, you can reimburse them for expenses. You can provide them reasonable benefits. And then you can provide them a nominal fee, which often comes in the form of a stipend. However, the nominal fee cannot be more than 20% of the total compensation that the employee would pay to a full-time employee for comparable services, right? So you can provide them for a stipend as long as it meets those criteria. And then you can pay them some combination of all 3, right? But the big one there that I get a lot of questions on is the nominal fee question. So another exemption potentially is seasonal employees. Now, as with most of these terms, I know we all have our own understanding or thought behind what a seasonal, especially in a place like Maine, right? I mean, we have seasonal employees all over the place, right? But the law has a particular definition for what a seasonal employee means for purposes of being exempt from overtime, right? So employees of seasonal recreational establishments are exempt from overtime pay provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So recreational, these include amusement parks, sports facilities, performance venues, boating, fishing, hiking, sightseeing, exploring, those kinds of organizations, right? That's what the law defines as recreational. And there are two types of ways for an employer to establish, there are two ways for an employer to be recognized as a seasonal establishment for purposes of the overtime exemption. One is that, and this is one of those that's either or, right? That does not operate for more than 7 months in any calendar year, right? So that's one way to be a seasonal employee. I often, I have some public sector clients who operate summer camps. They have beaches, so they hire employees to work the beaches in the summer, and typically their season is less than 7 months. So that would be an example. And then there's the 33 1/3% test. And this is if, and I took this language because it's not, often these statutes aren't written in a way that is necessarily makes sense. But this is exactly what the statute says, is that during the preceding calendar year, the employer's average receipts for any 6 months of such year were not more than 33% per centum of its average receipts for the other 6 months of such year. The monthly average based on total receipts for the 6 individual months in which the receipts were smallest should be tested against the monthly average for the 6 individual months when the receipts were largest to determine whether the test is met. So this is another way that you could say, okay, do I have seasonal employees, or recreational or amusement, employees that would be exempt from the overtime requirements. That's another way in which you can meet the exemption requirement. So the employee must perform recreational tasks. And what does that mean? I mean, it really means that, they're performing tasks related to the seasonal nature of the entity or the enterprise. So they're working on the beaches, they're working at the concession stands for like the Maine, what was the Old Orchard Beach, the park there that they have, the summer park, they're working in concessions, right? Tasks that are related to the recreational or amusement nature of the entity. So somebody who is like working in central office is probably not going to, and is responsible for administration. They are likely not going to qualify as seasonal employees under this exemption. Because they're not, they're really doing more administration operational type tasks. The employees who are subject to the seasonal exemption, they can work for more than 7 months as long as the establishment isn't open for more than 7 months. So in a lot of cases, you have what we often call the shoulder seasons, when beaches, for instance, they're, the summer organizations, they're getting ready to open. And so the work that they do to get ready doesn't count towards that 7-month exemption. As long as the organization is not officially open. It's not, selling tickets. It's not having events. And it's really just, we're preparing for the season, or we're rounding up the season, closing up shop, whatever that means. And employees cannot work year round. If they work year round, they are definitely not subject to the exemption.
And we had a couple questions that I don't think we'll get to in the examples at the end, but a really good question about for seasonal employees, what income counts toward receipts? Is it just earned income, or do contributed grants or investment income count? So especially for a nonprofit, if you're not deciding kind of when the grant schedule comes in.
Let's put that in. I don't know. It's a little more complicated. And I don't know the exact answer off the top of my head. Let's put that in our follow-up
great
blog that we're going to do, right, Mary Alice?
Yeah, great.
We'll just add we'll talk a little bit more about what are average receipts. What does that mean? What do you have to count? I think I know the answer, but I also may be confusing it with another aspect of the presentation today, and so I don't want to give out bad advice, but we'll follow up with that.
Great. And there was another, does this refer to all kinds of seasonal employees or only seasonal employees for recreational establishments?
So it's seasonal recreational. It includes amusement parks, sports facilities, performance venues, boating, fishing. Right. So the definition of recreational is pretty broad, I think, here. Right. So as long as it fits within, because they'll say, well, employees of seasonal and recreational establishments, and then they'll have a definition for what is seasonal and a definition for what is recreational. Right. Yeah. So, but I tried to put sort of the general types of entities that qualify. So it does include, performance venues, boating, fishing. I mean, again, the devil is always in the details, but this should give you a little bit of insight to the types of organizations or entities that would be covered.
Great. Okay.
Yep. So when we talk about, who is owed, we often talk in my world, non-exempt versus exempt employees. Those are sort of two legal terms of art, if you will, that in this sort of minimum wage and overtime, this wage and hour space that I work in, that we often use. And the non-exempt employees are the employees that are required to pay overtime. And sometimes I think of it, they're non-exempt, they're not exempt. You have to pay them overtime, right? Because sometimes I use them, I get them confused, even though I've been doing this for like over 15 years. This is the employee that is entitled to minimum wage. You have to pay this employee minimum wage depending on whichever is higher. Remember, I said you always pay, you always follow the statute in this world, or in the wage and hour universe. You always follow the statute that provides the employee with the most benefit, which under the minimum wage law is Maine. Minimum wage in Maine is currently $14.65. And it will be adjusted. Usually they do it around October, I believe, but they adjust it based on the cost of living. What is the cost of living that year? And then the legislature decides, what it's going to be for the following year. So they usually announce it, like I said, in October, November. So employers have time to change and adjust if necessary. But it will continue to go up, likely. I doubt it will, certainly won't go down. So the other aspect so that you have the minimum wage and for non-exempt employees, and the other aspect is overtime, right? So non-exempt employees are entitled to time and a half for all hours worked over 40 hours per week. Right. So that means that if they work 43 hours, they would be paid those 3 hours that they worked overtime. They get paid time and a half for those 3 hours. Now, this does not have to. Now, again, it says does not have to include vacation, sick, or holidays unless required by a CBA or other policy or agreement. So the law only requires that you pay them overtime over 40 hours worked. So those are 40 hours that the employee actually worked for you, right? Some weeks you'll have a holiday. So they'll only, maybe Monday was a holiday and it's a paid holiday. And then, they, let's say they work 38 hours over the next 4 days. So 8 hours of a paid holiday, right? That's 46 total hours. You don't, unless you have a policy that requires they get overtime with holiday or something else, you only have to pay them for 46 straight hours. You don't have to pay them overtime for those 6 hours because 8 of those total hours was holiday pay, was non-working time, right? So because the law only requires that you pay overtime for hours worked. Now, because I do have a number of clients, whether through their personnel policies or employment handbooks, or their collective bargaining agreements, they allow vacation, sick, holiday, or any sort of combination of those to count towards hours worked for purposes of overtime. That's your prerogative, right? The law doesn't require you to pay overtime for that, but that is your prerogative. And because you're more than complying with the law in those situations, it's okay to have that kind of policy. You can't have a policy that is less than compliant, right? I think that's obvious, but it bears mentioning and saying explicitly, right? You can have policies that exceed the requirements of the law, but they have to at baseline be in compliance with the law. And so then obviously if you have non-exempt employees, you also have exempt employees. And these are employees who are usually paid a salary and they are exempt from overtime, which means they get paid their salary whether they work 35 hours or whether they work 82 hours, right? In a work week. So they are also overtime exempt. Before we go into those employees, I wanted to just come back and say, one of the things that I often see, and this is a lot of my nonprofit clients do this as well, is they allow employees to flex their time. They say, okay, well, you know what? You worked 48 hours this week, so why don't you just work 32 next week? And they don't pay overtime on that week in which the employee worked 48. That is not legally compliant, right? If they work more than 40 hours in a given week, so a 7-day period, they are entitled to overtime pay, right? You can't flex overtime between work weeks. Now you can require them to reduce, if they're getting close to 40, you can manage overtime. You can say, you know what, can't work overtime this week. Or you could have a policy that says, if you're getting close to 40 hours in a work week, you need to talk to your supervisor or manager and get permission to work overtime. If they go ahead and work overtime anyway, you still have to pay them overtime. But in that situation, you could discipline them, give them a written warning, give them a verbal coaching, and say, look, that's a violation of our policy, right? And it could result in further disciplinary action, right? So you could discipline them for not following the policy if they work overtime without permission, without the supervisor's agreement. But you still will have to pay them if they work overtime. So there are ways you can sort of manage it. And I know that there are chats flying all over the place, but Mary Alice, I think you had one for me. Oh yeah, we're gonna get time for scenarios. I think yeah, I'm gonna continue to kind of fly through this just to allow to give time for scenarios. So exempt employees, these are also overtime exempt. Like I said, typically paid a salary. I put all of the various exemptions on this slide. The 3 primary ones that I deal with nonprofits are the ones that are sort of in bold there: executive, administrative, and professional. And we're going to go quickly through these because I think I think that this is usually where the questions lie for nonprofits. And I'll say it's primarily in the administrative space. For some of you today, there may be some questions in the professional space because it includes teachers and creative professionals. So some of you may have questions on that, but I will generally breeze through these, Mary Alice. So the one thing that I want to stress though is just because someone is paid a salary does not mean that they are exempt employees, right? And these salaried and exempt get used interchangeably by me and by my clients all the time. Oh, well, they're paid a salary, so I don't have to pay them overtime. Well, that's not the case. You can pay non-exempt employees a salary, So long as they are earning minimum wage and overtime. And you're like, wait, what does that mean? Well, maybe you pay somebody $1,000 a week, but they're really a non-exempt employee when you look at their job duties and what they're doing. But you know what? They work 37.5 hours a week, and they never really work more than that. They never really usually work less than that. You divide 1,000 by 37.5, it's more than minimum wage. You're going to be fine, right? But the risk comes when you're paying someone a salary and they are working overtime occasionally, or maybe when you divide it by the number of hours they work, they're not meeting the minimum wage threshold. We have an example of this that we're going to talk about at the end in our scenarios. So we'll talk more about that in a second. This goes to the salary basis, right? So all exempt employees generally, with the exception of teachers, and a few other IT and sales, and there are a few other ones, but for the most part, they have to at least be paid what's called a salary basis. Or the salary threshold. And so right now, the salary threshold for the federal government is $35,568. And the state is $43,950. The way the state calculates the salary basis is 3,000 times the minimum wage. So that come January 1, when the minimum wage will likely change, so too will the salary basis under Maine law. But right now it's $43,950. And so if you want it, so for exempt employees, they have to be paid this minimum salary threshold. They have to be paid regular monthly or shorter installments. That's a state law requirement. You cannot have part-time exempt employees by simply prorating their salary. And you can't reduce an exempt employee's salary for quality or quantity of work, except in a few situations. For instance, if they didn't work a full week in the first or last week, if they're on FMLA leave, which is right now, it's an unpaid leave. If they've exhausted all their sick time and they don't have any accrued time to utilize. Suspensions, if they're disciplined or they result in a suspension, and then a municipal budget furlough, which is not applicable to this audience. The presentation that Nat mentioned earlier, I think, was one that I gave, and that was because the Biden administration had significantly raised the salary threshold on July 1, and then again, it was supposed to raise on January 1 of this year, but federal courts, I believe in Texas, basically enjoined that executive order, and now we're back to this one, which was I think it was Obama who was able to increase it most recently to $35,568. I might be wrong about that. But again, that big hash mark, the big circle in the X says this is no longer in effect. So that's what that means. So there are, again, the exemptions. I'm going to go through these. The executive exemption generally is they have must regularly direct 2 or more FTEs, so full-time equivalents, and they have authority or influence over hiring, firing, and discipline. That's really the primary means to determine executive exemptions. The administrative exemption is probably the grayest of them all, and one, especially with nonprofits, that I spend a lot of time with my clients on. I have a lot of clients who have program associates or program administrators or, program associate is one that I deal with a lot. And the devil is, like I said, the devil is in the details. This provision must regularly exercise discretion and independent judgment. That is a legal phrase of art that also has volumes written on it. The professional exemption is one that we'll talk about a little bit, at least the ones that I think apply to this group. The work requires advanced knowledge and skills, a specialized intellectual study, and then there's that language again, must regularly exercise discretion and independent judgment, right? And I'm gonna just hold this open for a little bit. You all will get these slides, but what this slide says to me is get advice, call your lawyer. It's not clear. What does that mean? What does it mean to exercise discretion and independent judgment? Again, this is another area where volumes of decisions have been written, and it's often, you know, there is rarely a clear cut, yep, this is absolutely an administratively exempt employee. There are very few, and I will say generally in the nonprofit space, it's about a balance. Okay, what does this look and smell more like? What are the risks of not classifying this person as exempt versus classifying them non-exempt, right? What does that mean? And so often this is a conversation I have with my clients. What makes the most sense from a business perspective, given all of the facts and circumstances that we're considering? Some of which, by the way, facts and circumstances, some of which are legal considerations, some of them are business considerations, some of them are risks, right? What are the risks of doing X versus doing Y, right? And so that's a conversation that I often have with my clients. So the professional exemption, I put the professional exemption includes because I only highlight here the ones that I think apply to this group. There are others like, you know, lawyers, doctors, that kind of thing. So I wanted to really highlight the ones that I thought were relevant to this group, one of which is the creative professionals. Right. And again, these are legal terms of art, and I often put them in air quotes because what a creative professional may mean to you in your day-to-day life is likely different than what the Fair Labor Standards Act means to be a creative professional. So first of all, you have to meet the salary basis test, right? You have to be paying them at least $43,950. Under right, again, we're applying Maine law because that's the most beneficial. The employee's primary duty must be the performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. And then it generally applies to actors, musicians, composers, soloists, certain painters, writers, cartoonists, essayists, novelists, and others as set forth in the regulations, right? So there's more. These were the ones I highlighted that may be applicable to this group today. When in doubt, I always recommend checking in with your counsel. Teachers, I know some of you use teachers in a variety of ways, and so I wanted to highlight what the exemption means with teachers. So teachers who are excluded from the overtime, right? This idea of the teacher that's excluded from the overtime requirements. Their primary duty is teaching, tutoring, instruction, or lecturing in the activity of imparting knowledge. And if they are employed and engaged in this activity as a teacher in an educational establishment, right? So you need to be a teacher in an educational establishment. All right, this includes, but is not limited to, regular academic teachers, kindergarten, nursery school teachers, teachers of gifted or disabled children. And again, these are directly from the regulations. Teachers of skilled and semi-skilled trades and occupations, right? You know, home economics teachers, vocal or instrument music instructors. Again, when in doubt, check with counsel. Now you notice what's missing from this requirement is that there's no salary threshold required. And again, what is an educational institution, right? I've talked a lot about, yeah, we can talk all day about, well, you know, work for an educational institution? This is how and I think I saw a question about whether a museum is an educational institution. So I knew that that question would come up. So under the regulations, educational institution, these are, so preschool, public or private elementary or secondary school, an institution of undergraduate higher ed, graduate higher ed, an institution of professional education, or a vocational education. And then there's this, or operates a program or programs of scholarly research, which then has its own sort of definitions. What is a program of scholarly research? Clear as mud, right? Not easy, for sure. I'm going to skip over this slide. This is really sort of a check yourself slide, you know, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think really the meat of this, what we really want to talk about now are the scenarios. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to pause there actually, Mary Alice, just to make sure there's nothing I should jump in and answer or try to answer.
I think we're good. Yeah, let's do
Okay.
the scenarios.
Okay. All right, good. So scenario one, Heart of Maine Theater. I'm a soccer fan, so I kind of pulled that from the Hearts professional team. But Hearts of Pine Theater is a local theater company which puts on 4 to 5 of productions per year. In the weeks before the productions, the employees put in long hours for several weeks, often working lots of overtime. The employees aren't paid overtime, but instead receive comp time in the weeks after the production is over. The employees love it because they got a few weeks paid time off over and above the vacation and sick time they are earning. Anyone see any concerns, or I called it issue spotting, right? Anyone spot some potential issues that there may be here? Flex time issue, right? You got that? Okay, I saw a couple of flex time. Okay, so here it's called comp time in this. I know a lot of my clients call it comp time, they call it flex time, right? But compensatory time is actually a thing in the law. But only public employers can utilize compensatory time, right? So yes, this is comp time is not a thing. If you have employees who are working overtime, in most scenarios, you're required to pay them overtime. You can't flex their time or comp them time. And let me just say this, even though this doesn't apply to you all. Comp time under the law means that instead of paying them time and a half, they accrue compensatory time at the time and a half rate. So say somebody worked 45 hours one week, they could, instead of getting paid for 5 times time and a half, so that would be 7.5 hours. Instead of getting paid 7.5 hours, they would get comped 7.5 hours, so that to take at another time and use as sort of accrued time. But again, that does not exist. Compensatory time does not exist in the nonprofit or private for-profit world. So can the theater pay over the threshold for the high time weeks and lower in the other weeks and comply? So if they're exempt employees, all right, which means they don't satisfy one of the overtime exemptions, then you can't pay them at different rates, right? So if they're, there may be professional or creative professionals who are here that might qualify and maybe are working overtime. We don't know. We'd have to look at the list of the employees who are working this sort of fluctuating schedule. So there may be employees within this crew that would qualify for that creative exemption, but we'd want to look to see whether they qualify as defined by the Fair Labor Standards Act. Um, let's see, anything else? So yeah, those were really the two primary issues is, unless an employee who is working these long hours in advance of the production, if they don't qualify under one of the, there may be some administrative staff that would fall under the exemption, but likely, unless they qualify for one of the exemptions, you have to pay them overtime. Now, what I mentioned is one of the things you may do is you may be able to better structure their schedule. I know that that's not always the case, right? Maybe they work 3 longer days. Maybe they work, 4 10-hour days or 3 12-hour days, because that's what's required of the production. And maybe they do work some overtime, but maybe there's a way that you can better manage how much overtime, if this is a concern for you all or for your organization, right? There are other ways we can sort of, I think that overtime budget is, I know a lot of you are like, scratching your heads, oh boy, that could potentially be lots of money. But is there a way that you can you can manage that so that the bottom line isn't impacted as much, right? You could have people work longer days, for example.
And just quickly, we had a couple of questions I wanted
Yep.
to quickly clarify. One is public companies can use flex time, and by public here, you mean like government employees,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Yes. Public employers. Yes.
Yeah,
Like
I think
government, municipalities, quasi municipalities, state agents, some of the state workers, obviously, water districts,
yeah,
counties, right?
right.
That's what I mean by public employers. Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes I think we serve the public, but or yeah.
Yeah.
And then is it okay for an employer to, this isn't exactly this, but is it okay for an employer to round an employee's time to the nearest quarter hour? So e.g., an employee works 39 hours and 50 minutes and you round to 39.75, or do you have to pay to the minute?
You don't have to pay to the minute per se. I think that there are sort of some de minimis exemptions. So 0.05 might be one of those de minimis exemptions. And I think that some people have, some employers, I shouldn't say people, some employers have policies that if you punch out, before halfway through the quarter hour, you'll get paid to the quarter hour. And then if you get paid, if you punch out over halfway through the quarter hour, you'll get rounded up. So I think that would fall under the de minimis exemption that exists in the law. It's probably okay. There's certainly no problem rounding up, right? Because you're giving them more than they're entitled to. So generally that's okay. It's probably something you just want to run by council, but I have seen those types of policies. Yeah.
Great. And then along the lines of the exemptions, the highly compensated employees is not something that we have talked about at great length. At one point, I think I read that was not permitted in Maine, or I don't know, but
Yeah,
maybe.
and I don't have the highly compensated. There are, as usual, factors that you have to
Yeah.
Boxes you have to check with a highly compensated. I think it, and I see in the chat somebody says it's still 107. I think it still is 107.
Yeah, it got reverted back when
Yeah.
when the federal,
Yeah. And then there are factors. So with a highly compensated employee, there are certain other factors they have to meet, not just the salary basis. They, highly compensated employees have a different salary basis. But there are also other factors. So just because you pay somebody, the salary basis for a highly compensated employee, that's not enough. There are a couple other things that you have to meet. Maybe we can put those in our in the follow-up correspondence. But yeah.
And there's a Department of Labor does have an FAQ that I will link in here.
Yep.
That is pretty useful, so folks can reference that as well.
Yeah. So there's also, so we have a salary non-exempt employee who will be leading an overnight summer camp, essentially being with the kids 24/7 for a week. Do we need to pay overtime for everything over 40, including sleep time? So summer camps have their own exemptions. I didn't include those, in part because I think we were focusing on arts and culture organizations, but we can also include those rules. But if somebody is a salary non-exempt employee, there are exemptions for summer camp employees, but they're kind of specific, but we can include those. I think I talked about them like very briefly last in July when I was talking about to a broader audience. So we can definitely get that information for you. All right, so let's move on to the next scenario. Green Horizons Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to environmental conservation. They focus on planting trees, organizing local cleanup efforts, and educating communities about sustainable practices. The foundation has been growing rapidly and needs a variety of staff to manage its expanding programs. The organization decides to hire everyone as independent contractors, including program coordinators, event organizers, and educators. The Green Horizons Foundation justifies its decision to classify all workers as independent contractors because it's cheaper and they will save on benefits, taxes, and insurance. The workers like the flexibility, and so does the organization, and they can be hired on a project by project or seasonal basis, which makes things easier. Anything wrong here? Yeah, not compliant. I see in the chat. Yeah, I mean, this is a classic, situation. This is maybe a little bit over the top. I have very few clients who actually only hire independent contractors, but they exist out there. Usually it's well, we have this project that we want to do, and so we're just going to pay this person a 1099, or because that's just easier, right? And what I often hear, I hear this so often with regard to the independent contractor is, well, the employee wants it. That's how they want to get paid, right? And but that's not the legal test. Unfortunately, like I said, it's not always commonsensical, and it doesn't always make sense. But as I hope, it's pretty clear in Maine that most workers are not independent contractors. And I would say under the Maine law, that the two slides that I showed you, somebody who is a program coordinator, an event organizer, or an educator for the organization itself is likely going to be an employee. Now, I will say that there's a lot of gray area, but generally, if they're working for the organization on behalf of the organization, supporting the organization's mission, then likely they are going to be employees. So yes, you all not compliant. you all got that one straight away. So scenario 3, the Horizon Arts Collective was a small, beloved nonprofit organization dedicated to offering free art education to underserved communities. Founded 5 years ago, it quickly became a pillar of creativity and learning in the area, bringing artists in of all kinds to lead workshops in painting, dance, photography, music, and theater. The organization hired part-time teachers, or artists in residence, as they called them. These positions were presented as flexible, creative opportunities for talented individuals who are passionate about sharing their craft. The teachers were paid as independent contractors at a set amount per course, free to set their own hours and enjoy the autonomy of managing their own work, which was great since many of them worked multiple jobs. So one question, would these teachers or artists in residence, do you think that they would be teachers under the exemption that I put up here? Would they fall under the teacher exemption? Anyone? I'll leave it there for a little bit. What might be a question that you would want to ask here and maybe get more information about? Right. Somebody just started educational establishment. Is the Horizon Arts, I think that's what it was called. I'm not sure. These are made up. These are totally made up. Well, I mean, they might exist out there, but I totally made them up with the help of ChatGPT. But, you know, I think a big question here is the Horizon Arts Collective an educational institution under the FLSA rules and regulations? Probably not, right? But you know, that would be something that I'd want to, you know, as an attorney, I ask lots of questions of my clients, right? And so one of the questions I would have here is like, talk to me a little bit about what you do, how you were created, what was your primary mission, and those kinds of things. I suspect it probably is not an educational institution as defined. Then you know, it's probably not an educational institution, but I'd want to know some more information, probably. What about the artists in residence, as they call them? Right. So same here, I would probably want to know a little bit more about the artists in residence. What are they doing? What is their primary function? You know, how do they fit into the overall organization? You know, are they integral to the mission of the organization? How frequently are they brought in? You know, there's a lot more questions I would have, but they're probably not independent contractors. They may be, right? But I'd want a lot more information before I made that decision. I think these artists in residence look more potentially like possible independent contractors than at the Green Horizon Foundation, right? There are program coordinators, event organizers, right? I think there's no question there. But I think I would want to know more about this particular entity before I made a determination, right? This one is less clear, right? If they're not permanent, they come in as artists in residence, you know, this may be more like an independent contractor, but it's not clear from the facts we have. And so I would want to know a little bit more information. And there are a number of you know, comments here about the things that they do that look more like independent contractors, right? They're directing the course, their hours, they might work for others, they might not, but that's their choice. They're managing their own work. And so those are all factors which would definitely weigh more in favor of independent contractors, but there's a lot more information that I think I would like to know before making that determination. And while we're on this slide, you know, one of the things that I wanted to say to you is so what, right? So what, we're misclassifying, we may be misclassifying employees. And, for the most part, what I find is that a lot of organizations and entities are cruising along, everything's great. Um, and usually what it comes down to is you have an employee, or someone you're classifying as an independent contractor who gets disgruntled for some reason, and they don't like, they think they should get paid more, they think maybe they should get paid overtime, maybe they don't like the person that they're dealing with, that's overseeing their work. Maybe they get terminated, maybe their contract gets terminated, maybe and then they're sort of disgruntled and upset, and they give a call to the DOL. Most of the time it's to the Maine DOL. Sometimes it's to the federal DOL. And I will say that that is the most frequent way that my clients and the DOL meet, is because you have an employee who's unhappy, or thinks they should make more, or maybe they catch wind of the seminar, hopefully not, and they say, well, I should be getting more money, and they call the DOL. But usually it's, like I said, it's a disgruntled employee. Sometimes the Maine DOL has the right to do independent audits and just to come in and say, hey, I just want to look at your books. I just want to see how things are done. But that's not usually how they operate. And I will tell you, they're, in that space where they're doing sort of just pop-up audits, as we call them. They just show up on the doorstep, on your doorstep. It's not the nonprofit arts and culture space that we see a lot of those pop-up audits, if you will. We often see them in the restaurant space. I know that's not you all, but they're looking at, and construction is another place, because those are I hate to call them offenders, but those are where we often see the most issues. But that doesn't mean they won't. And I've had a couple of nonprofits who have had issues with employees who weren't terribly happy, and they leave under not so great terms. And then, the DOL knocks on the door, and the executive director is like, oh my gosh, what do I do? The DOL is here, right? And so, what I recommend that you do in those circumstances is be very polite and nice, and ask them for a minute. And this is what a lot of my clients do, say, just give me a moment, and then they go back into their office and give me a call, or give your whoever your attorney is, give them a call and say, okay, they're here, what do I do? Often you're going to have to comply with them anyway. I will say that one of the reasons that I recommend getting your attorney involved early is that you can help limit your attorney can help limit the scope of what the DOL is coming in. And I've had situations where my clients have called me after the fact, and it turns out the DOL went farther than they were initially intending to, and they found all sorts of other issues which were not part of their original reason for reaching out. And so sometimes we can help. Okay, so why are you here? What tipped you off? Who tipped you off? What are your concerns? And we really try to limit the scope of what they're there to review. And we always, I work cooperatively with them. I mean, that's a really important, piece, is to be cooperative. And sometimes you have to give them a lot of information. And the other way we can sort of help work with you is trying to mitigate any damages that may be assessed, or fines that might be assessed by the DOL. So if you do get, like I said, usually it's going to be the DOL, but you get an auditor or someone who is calling you up or knocking on your door, really important to give your counsel a call.
And sorry to interrupt, I just was going to suggest that we invite folks to put questions in the chat, because it's already 1:17, and I know we had talked about letting folks have a chance to answer some questions. I know we've answered a few along the way, but just yeah, we have this last scenario. And so I wanted to make sure that we
Yep.
can go through that, but also if folks have questions that we haven't answered along the way, maybe we can start to put those in the chat so that we can answer the ones we can in the chat and then get to them.
Yeah.
In just a moment.
Yeah. So this is an add-on for the teaching art scenario. The part-time instructors often find that they are working more than they're expected, lessons plans, preparing materials, attending mandatory staff meetings, and sometimes even doing administrative tasks like responding to emails or marketing the programs. And one teacher raises concerns with the executive director. So what should she do? What should the executive director do? What I wanted, and knowing we're up against time, what I wanted to sort of illustrate here is how things sometimes, you may start out as being independent contractors, and it may legally qualify, you know, the person, they may legally qualify as an independent contractor, but this is to show that sometimes things evolve and happen. And now hopefully you recognize that this really starts to look and smell a lot more like an employee, right? And so that was sort of the point of this. And again, what should she do? She probably should give her counsel a call, you know, to hopefully walk through how to get through that. This is, you know, a situation. I used to be on the board for a similar organization, and so this was the impetus for this organization, even though it's not art and culture necessarily. I think that this scenario will resonate with many of you. Get Outdoors Nordic is a small volunteer-run nonprofit which promotes wellness and getting outdoors through Nordic skiing, and it's rapidly growing organization. The board has decided that having a paid executive director would go a long way to help continue to grow the organization. The position is structured as a part-time 25 per hour week role. The board decided to take the salary threshold in Maine and prorate it for a 25-hour work week. So the salary is $28,125 per year. Right off the bat, any issues if the ED sticks to 25 hours a week? Yeah, so if the executive director sticks to 25 hours a week and works 25-hour a week pretty regularly, and that's all they work, this is probably okay as long as they're keeping track of their time, because if you take 540.87 and divide it by 25, they're getting paid at least minimum wage, at least I believe. I did the calculations before, but just to double check here, 540.87 divided by 25, they're making $21.63 an hour, much more than minimum wage. So in this scenario, if the executive director sticks to 25 hours a week, maybe even if they work a little bit more, they're probably going to be okay, right? As long as they're making at least minimum wage, right? Like I said, you can have employees. Why wouldn't in this situation, why is the executive director not a salaried exempt employee? I think I gave you a hint in the slides back along when I was introducing salary threshold, but they're not making the salary threshold, right? It's $43,950, right? So, and I think I said explicitly in that slide, you can't prorate a part-time employee and keep them exempt, right? So doesn't meet the salary basis and therefore would not be a salaried exempt employee, right? You could still pay them a salary, again, as long as they're making minimum wage, right? So as long as they're making minimum wage. So then let's talk about what if the executive director regularly works over 25, particularly during the winter months, and is often working over 40, right? So let's take the 540.87. Let's just say a 40-hour work week. Let's say they work 40 hours. Their hourly rate would be $13.52. That is less than minimum wage, right? So that would, at some point, there, you know, I don't know where in the range, but at some point over 25, they are going to be working less than minimum wage with this salary. So, and certainly if they meet 40, and if they're working overtime, they're not getting paid overtime, right? So that is the issue here, right? That it's that like I said, you can pay a salary to non-exempt employees, but you have to make sure that they're making at least minimum wage. And if they do work over 40, that they are getting overtime. So what should the organization do? Probably either consider paying them a minimum wage or increase their salary, right? One thing that I wanted to address in this scenario is that one of the things that I get a lot with my nonprofits is being an exempt employee, or I should say making a salary, is often kind of a rite of passage, and it's seen by a lot of employees as sort of a status, right? This idea that I'm making a salary now, and that's a big deal. And you know, and that's important, and I totally understand that, right? And so I have a lot of my clients when we're doing, I do I do classification reviews for employees or for my clients. I say, okay, who are the employees that you're concerned about? Give me their job descriptions and let's talk about whether or not they're exempt or non-exempt. And sometimes after I do that, I tell my clients these employees are non-exempt. And one of their major concerns is, well, I don't want to pay them an hourly rate because that will be seen as sort of a demotion, even though it's effectively not, even though now they're going to get overtime, right? I mean, they're actually going to likely get paid more money. And I understand that. So, you know, there are ways we can talk about how we impact overtime if overtime is a concern, and how we continue to pay them a salary so that we don't interfere with, you know, that sort of status, which I understand is very important to a lot of employees. So there are ways we can work with you on that. There is a question here. I think Mary Alice, you were going to jump on. We hear from orgs that pay a part-time executive director as an independent contract and not an employee. I don't know. You know, I think that this is one of those. I just don't see how you could have the executive director overseeing an organization be an independent contractor. Just given that their entire responsibility is to ensure the mission of the organization is being sort of instituted and following the, you know, following the requirements usually of the board of directors who oversees, you know, typically oversees the executive director. So I don't see a scenario. I mean, crazier things have happened. I don't see a scenario how you could pay an executive director as an independent contractor. But I am more than happy to look at a specific scenario, right? The law is, there are very few sort of black and white answers to a lot of these questions. This is closer to, I'd say, a black and white one, but I have been surprised, you know, but we'd have to do the analysis for sure. But I'm somewhat skeptical that you'd have a scenario where an ED would actually be an independent contractor.
Yeah, I think that is unfortunately kind of a common one. I just want, so it's 126, and so I want to see, I know there were, Martin, I saw you had asked a question about paying a lower rate of pay for the off season, so that they're over a salary. I think you're asking over a salary threshold in the winter, and then a minimum, more of a minimum wage in the off season. But I think, Anne, you said they have to be paid the same.
Yeah, so as I think one of the slides says, the FLSA is full of exemptions. There are situations that if you have a regular fluctuating calendar, and it's very specific, right? It's not just sometimes I fluctuate and then other times I don't. There has to be, and I don't have the factors in off the top of my head, but there are situations where you can pay someone the same fluctuating work weeks. That's what it's called under the Fair Labor Standards Act, a fluctuating work week. And there are ways that you can pay somebody that, or pay an employee that has fluctuating work weeks in an effort to reduce the overtime exposure. But they're very specific, and you have to have an agreement with the employee. The employee has to agree to it, and it has to be in writing. But there are what's called fluctuating work week scenarios that the FLSA recognizes. But there are, again, like with all of these things, there are specific factors that you have to meet in order to be able to allow an employee to be under one of the flexible fluctuating work week agreements.
Great. I think that's when we can add a little bit more information in the follow-up. There was a question that came in ahead of time that was just like, if when job descriptions are updated, how does pay change? So just sort of assuming that like whatever the new job duties are needs to also meet the test of whatever it is you're asking them.
Absolutely. And look, sometimes when I see this all the time in nonprofits where, people assume more and more responsibility as they get better at the job, as they get more familiar with the organization, with the, with the funders. I mean, they just take on more and more. And at some point you might have an employee who maybe does qualify for one of the exemptions, right? And so yeah, I think regularly updating job descriptions is really important, especially if you have employees who are taking on more and more work. One of the concerns, so there are a couple of concerns, and I saw something in one of the, I think it was one of the, but one of the things that's really important about keeping your job descriptions updated is, one of the things, if the DOL does come in, they're going to ask for your job descriptions, but they're not going to stop there. They're going to say, oh, and by the way, I want to talk to this employee and I want to hear directly from this employee what they actually do. And so if you have a job description that's not reflective of the actual day-to-day job requirements, that could potentially be problematic, right? Because that's not where they're going to stop. And the same with me. Whenever I do a classification audit for one of my clients, the first thing I ask for is the job description. But then I'm going to talk to the managers, I'm going to talk to the supervisors and say, okay, well, tell me what this person actually does, right? Because we may need to update the job description. So it's really important to have accurate job descriptions.
Well, it's 1:30 and I know 1:41. I know folks are going to have to jump off. We did take note of questions that we got in the chat and questions that we got ahead of time. I think we got to most of them. There are a few I think that were that require a little bit more backup or just some extra information, and so we will create a blog post and this video will be in there. I want to say thanks again to the Onion Foundation and to Anne. Thank you, Anne. I know this is a lot of time. And so thanks for all of you for coming. If you have other questions, we can try to answer them. Department of Labor is available to answer questions that you have. They do wage and hour trainings also, and Anne is a great resource, and Molly included another link in the chat there. So as you sign off, you'll get a little blurb about a feedback survey so we can keep improving the kind of things we offer to members. And so please take that, and we'll send a follow-up survey, a follow-up email with all the resources pretty soon. So thank you all once again.
All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.